The smoke is clearing over Los Angeles, and you are the supreme commander of the largest invasion fleet in human history in the year 2030. You've done the impossible. You've bypassed the U.S. Navy, neutralized the Air Force, and your boots are physically on the ground in California. You are winning. But then, your phone rings. It's not your generals. It's your finance minister back home. He's screaming. In the last 10 minutes, while you were celebrating, your entire country's bank accounts just hit zero. Your soldiers' paychecks? Bounced. The fuel for your tanks. The supplier just canceled the shipment because your currency is now worth less than the paper it's printed on. You look up. There are no American bombers in the sky. There are no Marines charging the hill. Just silence. You didn't lose the war on the battlefield. You lost it on a spreadsheet 3 minutes ago. Forget the guns. The reason you can't invade the United States is that they own the casino. They printed the chips. And you're just a guest. Most military analysts love to talk about the map. They will point to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and tell you they are the greatest defensive assets in history. 2 massive liquid walls that make a surprise attack logically impossible. They will talk about the Appalachian Mountains, the vast deserts of the Southwest, and the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to march an army across a continent that spans 4 time zones. Then they will bring up the guns. They love to quote the statistic that American civilians own nearly half of all the civilian-owned firearms in the world. The fantasy is vivid. A hostile army landing in Texas only to be picked off by a militia behind every blade of grass. It makes for a great movie, but as a modern defense strategy, it is obsolete. That version of invincibility is a relic of the 20th century. It relies on the assumption that an enemy needs to physically occupy your territory to defeat you. But warfare has evolved. In an era of hypersonic missiles that can travel at Mach 5 and strike anywhere on the globe in under an hour, the Pacific Ocean is no longer a barrier. It is just a minor inconvenience. We live in a world where state-sponsored cyber warfare can shut down the electrical grid of the entire eastern seaboard, poison water supplies, or scramble air traffic control systems without a single soldier ever leaving their barracks in Moscow or Beijing. If geography and rifles were the only thing standing between the United States and destruction, the American empire would have collapsed 20 years ago. Yet, the United States remains untouched. It operates with a level of geopolitical impunity that no other nation in history has ever dared to attempt. They sanction superpowers, seize foreign assets, and dictate global policy, all while their homeland remains perfectly safe. Why? Because while the rest of the world was obsessed with counting tanks and measuring naval fleets, Washington was constructing a different kind of fortress. They were digging a moat you can't see. The true American defense system isn't made of iron or steel. It is built on debt, leverage, and the desperate need of every other nation on earth to keep the American economy afloat. The United States realized that if you control the currency of global trade, you don't need to occupy a country to own it. You simply need to make sure that their entire economy depends on yours. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated architectural shift that began on a specific date in the middle of the last century, a moment when the U.S. changed the rules of war forever. Most people look back at that day as a boring diplomatic meeting, but it was actually the most successful military maneuver of all time. It was the day the world voluntarily walked into a cage and handed the Americans the key. The genius of this strategy is that it turns the global economy into a hostage situation. If a rival nation tries to bring down the U.S., they have to burn their own savings to do it. The U.S. discovered that the best way to protect your borders isn't to build a wall, It's to force your enemies to pay for the bricks. This is the kind of history they don't teach in school. If you want to see more deep dives like this, hit the like button to let the algorithm know. Now, we have to go back to a quiet, elegant hotel in New Hampshire in July of 1944. Outside, the Second World War was still raging. Europe was being reduced to rubble, Japan was burning, and the great empires of the Old World were bankrupt. But inside the Mount Washington Hotel, the air was cool, the champagne was expensive, and the United States was about to pull off the greatest heist in history without drawing a weapon. Delegates from 44 nations gathered there, desperate for a solution. Their economies were shattered. Their currencies were volatile, worthless paper. They looked to the Americans for salvation, and the Americans were happy to oblige. They laid a simple fact on the table. The United States held nearly 80% of the world's gold reserves. The British Empire was drowning in debt. The Soviets were decimated. America was the last shop open for business. So, the U.S. delegates offered a deal that sounded incredibly generous. They proposed a system where every country would peg their currency to the U.S. dollar. In exchange, the United States promised to peg the dollar directly to gold at $35 an ounce. It was a guarantee of absolute stability. The message was clear. Holding a U.S. dollar was legally and physically the same as holding a bar of gold bullion. It was good as gold, backed by the impregnable vaults of Fort Knox. For the broken nations of Europe and Asia, this looked like a lifeline. They wouldn't have to worry about stabilizing their own money. They could just hitch their wagon to the Americans' engine. It brought order to the chaos. It allowed global trade to restart. It seemed like a benevolent act of a big brother helping his siblings get back on their feet. But that is not what was happening. By agreeing to this system, the world effectively agreed to conduct all their international business in American currency. If France wanted to buy wheat from Argentina, they used dollars. If Japan wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, they used dollars. The greenback became the oxygen of the global economy. The United States had successfully convinced the entire planet to build their financial houses on American land. The delegates signed the Bretton Woods Agreement with relief, thinking they were getting an insurance policy against future chaos. They didn't read the fine print. They hadn't realized that by making the dollar the standard, they were giving Washington the power to control the value of everyone else's labor. They thought they were accepting a partner, but they were actually crowning a king. For nearly 3 decades, the system worked perfectly. Economies boomed, trade flourished, and the dollar reigned supreme. Trust was absolute because the promise was absolute. $35 equals 1 ounce of gold. But the United States had a secret. They were spending money they didn't have. They were printing more paper claims on gold than there was actual gold in the vaults. They were running a tab that they never intended to pay, effectively robbing the bank while they were the ones guarding the safe. The world was about to find out that their insurance policy was worthless. The cracks started showing in the late 60s. America was burning cash on the Vietnam War and massive domestic programs, flooding the world with paper dollars. The French were the first to do the math. President Charles de Gaulle, a man who never trusted the Anglo-Saxons, looked at the mountains of green paper piling up in French banks and decided he'd prefer the heavy yellow metal promised in the contract. He didn't just ask nicely. He reportedly prepared to send the French Navy to ship the physical gold back to Paris. Other nations saw this and panicked. The rush was on. Switzerland, Germany, Spain. Everyone started lining up at the gold window of the U.S. Treasury, waving their dollars and demanding their bullion. The United States was bleeding gold. The vault at Fort Knox was draining so fast that if the trend continued, America would be insolvent within months. The scam was up. The landlord didn't have the deed to the house. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted Sunday evening television to save the empire. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit bankruptcy. Instead, he looked into the camera and calmly announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That word, temporarily, was the most expensive lie ever told. It has been over 50 years, and that window never reopened. In plain English, the United States just defaulted on the entire planet. They told the world, that contract we signed, we're ripping it up. Those dollars you're holding, they're just paper now. Deal with it. By all conventional logic, this should have been the end. The dollar should have collapsed to zero. Global trade should have ground to a halt. The nations of the world, having been defrauded of their national savings, should have united to crush the American economy. But they didn't. They froze. They were stuck in a paradox of mutually assured financial destruction. If they declared the dollar worthless, their own reserves became worthless. They had hoarded so much American paper that destroying the U.S. economy would be an act of suicide. They were angry, yes, but they were paralyzed. However, Washington knew this paralysis wouldn't last forever. You can only run a global empire on IOU notes for so long before people stop accepting them. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith, and faith is a notoriously shaky foundation for a superpower. The sharks were circling. The U.S. was vulnerable for exactly 3 years, drifting without a tether. To survive, they needed a new anchor. They needed to back the dollar with something more essential than gold, something that every nation needed, something people would kill for. Gold is heavy. It sits in a vault and does nothing. But oil. Oil is the blood of the modern world. Without it, tanks don't move, factories don't run, and cities go dark. In 1974, in the shadow of an energy crisis that had Americans lining up for miles just to fill their gas tanks, Washington sent Treasury Secretary William Simon to the Arabian Desert on a quiet, high-stakes mission. The objective was simple: replace gold with black gold. The deal struck with the House of Saud was the ultimate protection racket. The United States offered the Saudi royal family an ironclad guarantee of military security. The U.S. Navy would patrol their waters, American contractors would build their bases, and Washington would ensure their dynasty survived any threat, foreign or domestic. In exchange, the Saudis had to do just one thing. They had to price every single barrel of oil they sold exclusively in U.S. dollars. Not some of it, all of it. And since Saudi Arabia controlled the erratic heartbeat of the OPEC cartel, the rest of the oil-producing world quickly fell in line. This masterstroke solved the problem Nixon had created 3 years earlier. It meant that if Germany, Japan, or Brazil wanted to keep their lights on, they couldn't just pay with marks, yen, or reais. They had to go out and acquire U.S. dollars first. And how do you get U.S. dollars? You send your cars, your electronics, and your raw materials to the United States. You work for them. You trade your real, tangible goods for their printed paper just so you can turn around and buy the fuel you need to survive. Suddenly, the U.S. didn't need to make products. They just needed to print paper. The demand for the dollar was no longer based on trust. It was based on necessity. Even better, the oil-producing nations now had massive piles of U.S. currency they couldn't possibly spend at home. So they did the only logical thing. They invested it right back into U.S. Treasury bonds. This petrodollar recycling meant the U.S. could run massive deficits, fund a global military empire, and live beyond its means, all paid for by the nations they were dominating. But this system requires absolute obedience. It is the third rail of geopolitics. You can criticize American culture, you can vote against them at the UN, but you do not touch the currency of the energy trade. There's a very short, very violent list of leaders who decided to sell their oil for euros or gold instead of dollars. Saddam Hussein announced he would switch Iraqi oil sales to the euro in 2000. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African dinar to bypass the dollar in 2011. Notice a pattern? They didn't just lose their economies, they lost their lives. Let's look at the body count. We analyze these invisible geopolitical threats every other day. If you want to stay ahead of the curve while the rest of the world is distracted, make sure you are subscribed. While physical assassinations are messy and public, the modern American empire prefers a weapon that is silent, invisible, and infinitely more devastating. It doesn't require a drone strike or a SEAL team. It lives in the server rooms of a nondescript office park outside Brussels. To understand how it works, you have to look at the anatomy of a transaction. Imagine a tycoon in Shanghai wants to buy a luxury estate in Italy. He opens his laptop, authorizes a $50 million transfer, and watches the funds leave his account. You might assume that money flies digitally from China to Europe in a straight line. It doesn't. It travels through a complex nervous system known as SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. This network connects over 11,000 financial institutions across 200 countries. It is the plumbing of global capitalism, the messenger that tells Bank A to credit Bank B. On paper, SWIFT is a neutral international cooperative based in Belgium, operating under European law. It is supposed to be the Switzerland of banking, blind, impartial, and open to everyone. But that is a fiction, because the vast majority of international trade is conducted in dollars. Almost every major transaction must eventually clear through a U.S. correspondent bank in New York. This gives the United States a super user key to the entire system. They can see everything, every wire, every purchase, every bribe, and every terror plot funding request passes through their checkpoint. But surveillance is not the weapon. Expulsion is. When Washington decides to revoke a nation's access to SWIFT, it is the economic equivalent of severing the spinal cord. It happens instantly. 1 minute, you are a modern nation. The next, you are digitally quarantined. Credit cards stop working. ATMs go dark. Your businesses cannot import medicine or export wheat. You cannot buy parts for your airplanes or software for your hospitals. Your ships are left stranded at sea because the insurance companies can't process the payments to dock them. You are instantly exiled from the 21st century. Iran learned this the hard way. One day they were a global oil exporter. The next, they were reduced to bartering pistachios and carpets in backroom deals because their digital money had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. It is a siege without a siege engine, starving a population not by blocking the roads but by blocking the code. For decades, this financial nuclear winter was considered a theoretical option, a doomsday scenario that was too dangerous to actually use against a major power. The fallout was predicted to be too unpredictable, the collateral damage too high. It was the red button behind the glass that you threatened to press, but never actually touch. That changed. The glass has been shattered. The United States didn't just threaten a nuclear superpower with this weapon. They pulled the trigger and watched an empire melt down in real time. Vladimir Putin spent over a decade preparing for February 20th, 22. He was not blind to the risks. He knew that sending tanks across the border would trigger an economic counterattack. So, he built Fortress Russia. He aggressively paid down national debt and stockpiled a staggering war chest of roughly $640 billion in gold and foreign currency reserves. The plan was mathematically sound. Even if the West cut off trade, Russia had enough savings to weather the storm for years. But he made a fatal calculation error. He assumed that while the West might sanction individuals or companies, they would never touch the sacred reserves of a sovereign central bank. He believed that the rules of global finance were neutral. He was wrong. In a coordinated strike that took less than 48 hours to execute, the United States and its allies didn't just lock the doors, they seized the vault. In a move that had no legal precedent in modern history against a G20 nation, the G7 froze roughly half of Russia's entire accumulated wealth. $300 billion, money earned from selling oil, gas, and wheat, was instantly paralyzed. Picture the scene inside the Russian central bank in Moscow. You are Governor Elvira Nabiullina, a brilliant economist respected worldwide. You sit down at your terminal to stabilize the crashing ruble, ready to deploy the billions you have saved for this exact moment. You type in the command, and nothing happens. The screen blinks back at you. The accounts in New York, London, and Frankfurt are visible, but the funds are frozen solid. Imagine logging into your banking app and seeing a notification that reads, "Access denied. Contact the White House for further assistance." The shockwave of this moment traveled far beyond Moscow. In Beijing, Riyadh, and New Delhi, leaders watched with cold realization. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. You can spend decades building an invasion fund, you can sell your resources, and you can see the balance on the ledger. But if that ledger is maintained by a Western institution, it is not your money. It is theirs. You are merely being granted custody, a privilege that can be revoked the moment you cross a geopolitical red line. This is the ultimate defense. It turns the aggressor's own wealth against them. Why bother fighting an army when you can simply turn off their wallet? But in demonstrating this terrifying power, the United States violated the cardinal rule of banking: trust. By weaponizing the reserve currency, they proved that the system is rigged, and in doing so, they created a fatal flaw in their own armor. Oh yeah, microscopic fracture in the dollar's dominance that is cracking wider with every passing day. Armchair economists love to fantasize about the China option. The theory goes like this: Beijing holds roughly $800 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. It is a mountain of debt that essentially funds the American way of life. If tensions ever reached a breaking point over Taiwan or the South China Sea, the Communist Party could simply push a button, dump all that debt onto the open market at once, and crash the U.S. financial system. They could send interest rates skyrocketing, destroy the value of the dollar, and bring the American machine to a grinding halt without firing a single missile. It sounds like the perfect kill shot. It is clean, bloodless, and devastating. But in reality, this strategy is not an attack. It is a suicide vest. The relationship between the American consumer and the Chinese factory is not a rivalry. It is a symbiosis born of desperation. The United States and China are effectively two men handcuffed together standing on the edge of a cliff. If China were to dump their treasuries, the value of the dollar would plummet. Since the vast majority of China's foreign reserves are stored in dollars, they would be actively vaporizing their own national savings. They would be setting fire to their own house just to singe the neighbor's lawn. But the damage goes deeper than balance sheets. The Chinese economy is built on a foundation of exporting cheap goods to the West. They need Americans to keep buying iPhones, solar panels, and plastic toys. If they crash the U.S. economy, the American consumer stops spending. When the American consumer stops spending, Chinese factories close. Unemployment in Shanghai spikes, and social unrest begins to simmer. By destroying their biggest customer, China would be inducing their own Great Depression. This is the financial version of mutually assured destruction. It creates a paradox where the United States' greatest enemies are also its biggest investors. They are forced to keep the American economy alive because its death would trigger a global contagion that no one is equipped to survive. If the US dollar collapses, it drags the euro, the yen, and the yuan down into the abyss with it. The global supply chain freezes, credit markets lock up, and the world returns to a barter system within weeks. So the invaders left with a terrifying realization. You cannot storm the beaches because of the Navy. You cannot strangle the energy supply because of the petrodollar. You cannot seize their assets because they control the banks. And you cannot crash their economy because you are inextricably tied to it. The fortress is hermetically sealed. Every external avenue of attack leads to self-destruction. The United States has engineered a system where it is mathematically impossible to conquer them from the outside. But history teaches us that unbreachable walls do not guarantee survival. Empires rarely fall because of what happens at the gates. They fall because of what happens in the throne room. If you can't invade them with guns and you can't invade them with money, there is only one option left. You have to wait for them to do it to themselves. The only force capable of dismantling the United States is not a foreign army or a rival currency. It is the compound interest on its own ledger. While the Pentagon spends $800 billion a year building ships and jets to fight external wars, a much more dangerous enemy has breached the Capitol. It is a mathematical inevitability. The national debt has spiraled beyond $34 trillion. For the first time in history, the government is spending more on interest payments to service that debt than it spends on the entire military. Think about that. The cost of the past is now consuming the budget for the future. To keep this machine running, to keep the lights on and the aircraft carriers sailing, Washington must print trillions of dollars every few years. This was the moat we talked about earlier. The ability to print the global reserve currency was supposed to be the ultimate shield, but flood a moat with too much water, and eventually it undermines the foundation of the castle. By weaponizing the dollar, by sanctioning the world, and by printing endlessly to fund it all, the U.S. is eroding the one thing that gives fiat currency its value: faith. We are watching the slow-motion erosion of the empire from within. Inflation is the fever that signals the infection. Domestic division is paralyzing the political body. The infrastructure is crumbling, not because of enemy bombers, but because the funds needed to fix it are being eaten by debt service. An invader looking at this situation realizes they don't need to fire a shot. They just need to stand back and watch gravity take over. The greatest irony of the 21st century is that the American defensive strategy has worked too well. The United States has integrated itself so deeply into the global nervous system that it has become too big to fail. The rest of the world is now in the terrified position of holding up a stumbling giant, not out of loyalty, but out of self-preservation. Beijing, Berlin, and Tokyo continue to buy the debt and accept the dollar because the alternative, a sudden American collapse, would result in a dark age for everyone. So, the United States remains impossible to invade, not because of the Marines guarding the coast, and not because of the missiles in the silos. It is safe because the world cannot afford to let it lose. The global economy is a hostage, and the United States is the pilot of the plane. You can hate the pilot, you can plot against him, but you certainly don't want him to crash while you are sitting in the passenger seat. If you enjoyed this autopsy of the American empire, you need to see how they're using this same weapon against crypto right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe.